Well, thank you for having me, and it's fun to be here. The BookServer effort is still relatively young, but it has a very strong history. And the great thing about a project like this, which is really an open source project, is that you get to implicate many other people at the same time that you get to implicate yourself. So I can point fingers almost everywhere now. There were a lot of motivations here, but the key one was trying to get information about books as distributed as possible across the net so that people could find information when they wanted to do that. And really we were motivated in part at the Internet Archive because we have 1.8 million books, and we really wanted to raise some awareness of those books and try to expose them on the net. But our needs matched the needs of many others, and so we started moving on with this project. So the key things here were the challenges of finding the book that you really wanted to be reading or browsing, struggling with the format of the book, is it PDF or EPUB or MOBI, and then acquiring the book. So taking each one of these in turn, of course, we all know, we're familiar with these challenges. Finding the book is a non-trivial exercise many times. You could look for the book on the web. You could look for the book at a publisher website like Tor, particularly strong example. You might go to your local library website if you do a lot of business, if you're familiar with the library. There are online bookstores, of course. There are indie bookstores, and there are alternative vendors. And no one really knows, unless I think you're in the industry, where they should be going to look for a particular kind of book, because it's just very difficult. You get married to a device, and sort of the wider universe of options is often hidden from you. So in the format of the book, of course, we struggle with PDFs. We have the EPUBs, we have MOBIs. Increasingly, we're talking about cloud-based delivery systems. So Google Editions is an example of that. And then, of course, we have potentially quite non-standard books that might be delivered in the future, such as Blio. And then libraries might want to create pointers to books online that don't really deliver the book as a package at all immediately, but they're pointers to some other kinds of transaction, like an interlibrary loan. And then once you acquire the book, you have the problem of actually integrating it with whatever platform you're using to read the book. You've got Kindles and Sony Readers and Nooks, and then reading platforms that Liza discussed earlier, like IBIS and Aldico and Kobo. And of course, a lot of people are still reading on their desktops or their desktops plus equipment. We has famously had some licenses for ebook content, and so we're beginning to see ebooks spread across, sort of a diaspora of equipment. And then, of course, how can you not avoid mentioning the iPad? So, this mix of stuff has really created for users over the last 6 months particularly, and really over the last year, this really very difficult scenario where acquiring the book for the right device and the right format, finding the book, installing the book, and then ultimately reading the book, particularly if there's DRM that's been invoked somewhere in that process, is really a kind of a painful set of circumstances for anyone to have to navigate. But what readers really want is pretty obvious, which is to be able to find the books that they want for the devices that they have, and for that to be a fairly straightforward process, not for it to be a really difficult discovery and integration exercise. And what book distributors want is also really quite straightforward and quite simple. They want to make the books generally as available as possible through as many different venues as possible with accurate descriptive information so that readers can find the books and have that be under the sales and use terms that they've stipulated. They're putting the book out there for a certain set of conditions, and they would like to have those conditions addressed. And it's been interesting. I've been heavily involved in the Google Book Search settlement, and I'm not exactly sure, I can't remember now when the Department of Justice originally made its first filing, but they called out this same identical need. And so I figure, when you've got the U.S. Department of Justice on your side, things aren't too bad. But Justice said, in quoting there from the statement that they filed with the court, book data provided should be available in multiple standard open formats supported by a wide variety of different applications, devices, and screens. So there they were thinking about the ramifications of a project like Google Book Search, which is obviously doing mass digitization, something, again, that the Internet Archive shares in terms of the travails of making available our content to a wider audience. And so, we definitely echo that very strongly. So really what we're looking for then is some kind of conception about a web of books. In the same way that we've had a web of data online and people can navigate using their browsers to find information, we really want to try to figure out a way of creating a system that we call now BookServer that will enable people essentially to find books however they're scattered across the net, by publishers, by booksellers, by libraries, under the terms that have been specified. And that's what BookServer is. So this nice tagline, creating a new architecture using common open standards that permits people to find, buy, acquire, and read books from any source, on any device, using many different ebook applications. And we've heard iterations of this through today already, but this is right at the heart of the mission of BookServer. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of this and how this came to be. And there were two forks that are predominant here. The first, I think we have to acknowledge the work of Stanza, of course, lexical, two individuals primarily, created this very nice, very attractive application for reading on the iPhone fairly early and acquired tremendous market share. And the developers of Stanza had a particular problem that they needed to solve. They wanted to be able to put a very attractive user interface on the process of finding and acquiring books. And they wanted to be able to list the books that were available to the user of the application. Now, that may sound really simple, and in hindsight, they came up with a relatively simple solution, but it was a bit of a head-scratcher because there was no way of doing that at the time that made a lot of sense. And so they bandied about a few ideas, and they talked with various people, including some people at O'Reilly, and the solution that they came to, ultimately, was to use an XML standard called Atom. Now, Atom is used for news syndication. So many of you, even if you don't know the word Atom, you've used Atom whenever you've used a newsreader. And it's just a fairly straightforward schema that's intended to highlight a list of things that are available. And gee, that made a lot of sense for books. And so Stanza sort of did a quick kludge run through Atom to make it suit their needs for displaying book information. And out of that, they were enabled to provide access to the users information about all the books that were available to the Stanza application. Very nice, very sort of good kludge there. At the same time, I was working at the Digital Library Federation, and there was this interesting thread that emerged actually on a podcast with an English company called Talus and a participant from Google Books. And the question was, could libraries expose their catalogs to search engines in a way that would facilitate a user going to a search engine to find a book? And the premise here was that instead of having to think, oh, what's the, library web address for Berkeley, California, I could just go to Google, and particularly if I had established my geolocation with Google, I would be able to type in the name of the book. Berkeley Public Libraries exposed its data to Google for harvesting. I was like, oh, well, yes, that book is there at the Berkeley Public Library, and then maybe here's a URL that will actually allow me to check that book out if I have public library credentials. So that was sort of the premise of the idea. And totally independently of lexical, we were also starting to think about, well, should we use Atom for that, or should we use this other protocol called Sitemap, which is expressly designed for harvesting, and we were moving toward actually adopting Atom. And then my library organization put itself out of business, so much for that conversation. But the lexical work was fairly prominent in publishing, and we started having discussions of it in the IDPF board, and I'm lucky enough to be a member with the IDPF board. And IDPF was a natural forum for that to be discussed because obviously people who support EPUB want to see EPUB books everywhere, and so this was another vehicle to make that happen. We also had follow-up conversations at a Tools of Change meeting over a year ago, and then at a Web Expo meeting, Lexical actually convened a small meeting of a few of us and just said, look, we really want to see the standard out there survive and do well, and we want it to be standardized in the open standards community. And so they sort of drop-kicked it into an open sphere, and then since that time, O'Reilly, the Internet Archive, to some extent Adobe, and many others have worked to standardize the schema in a way that better supports the needs of the publishing community. So this was launched in April '09 with a blog post by Bill McCoy of Adobe, and he gave it in my light a somewhat unfortunate name of Open Publication Distribution System, which is a bit of a mouthful, but he wrote, the Open Publication Distribution System is a generalization of the Atom approach used by Stanza's catalog. I believe this effort has the potential to be a critical enabler to the growth and access to and adoption of digital books. So just to pause, there are a set of terms I've already used, but just to cleanly delineate them. So when I talk about BookServer is sort of the vision of the architecture, how this works, making books accessible online, building this web of books. So when we talk about that grander vision, we're talking about BookServer. So BookServer is just a handle for referring to that vision. OPDS is the technical specification that we're developing. So it's the formal name for the specification. And with OPDS, we generate catalogs. And catalogs are just simply the manifests of books. So we'll often use terms like OPDS catalog. And then, of course, Atom is the underlying schema that's been used to generate an OPDS format file. Now, because OPDS is based on Atom, there's some affordances right out of the box that we can all take advantage of as reading developers, as publishers, and as distributors. And because OPDS is Atom, it can be understood pretty much out of the box by web browsers, by newsreaders, and with a fairly trivial amount of work, any kind of mobile application. And I'll give you an example of how that out-of-the-box experience actually looks, and could be worse. And because catalogs are fairly simple XML statements, they're very easy to make. They're not exorbitant in the needs of labor. Any website could run a bookstore or library by producing an OPDS file. Libraries could generate these things fairly automatically. Search engines could gather the information across various distributors and provide an interface to them. And of course, aggregators could pull together various OPDS files from multiple publishers and create their own storefronts by providing a single point of entry to many different publishers or libraries or bookstores. And because, as Michael Tamblyn mentioned earlier today, OPDS catalogs contain very simple, clear statements about what titles are available, they shine in a B2B transfer of information from one distributor to another to highlight what information is actually available, what titles might be available for certain kinds of transactions. And then one of the nice things about OPDS, in contrast to many of our applications for Onyx and Mark, is that you don't have to embed everything in the world that you know about a book in a metadata transfer. And instead, essentially, you can embed a pointer to additional information in the same way that you would embed a pointer to a transaction. And embedding sort of pointers to information that might live elsewhere in other formats enables you to form a lightweight manifest that you can move around the net very easily. And in the future, there's this concept called real-time web. And again, because this is built on XML, these real-time web notifications, which alert users almost immediately through sort of connected services, are again baked into this format. And this kind of real-time notification to users or other systems is fairly straightforward. Now, this isn't something that's widely adopted yet, but it would be relatively trivial to build. Now, this is an example of how this looks just through a native web browser. This is an individual in France who approached me at Tools of Change in New York, and he supports the site reviews.org, which is an aggregation of major academic society journals in France. And he created an OPDS file for all of the journals from those societies, for the journal, the issue, and all of the titles in the issue. And this took his engineer literally only a matter of days to construct. It was an amazingly trivial example in terms of work, but a very powerful one in terms of capability. And you can see here just a very simple navigation interface that he's put on top of it. I'll just give you one other screenshot. This is actually at the point of delivering article level a publication to the user. So if you hit one of these links, you get a PDF, which is in the science, technical, medical arena, still sort of the default delivery mechanism for many kinds of journal content, but it could be any kind of content. So again, just being able to construct across an aggregated set of publications an OPDS catalog that enables even basic web browsing in a matter of days highlights the power, the utility of this kind of lightweight specification. So what is in a catalog? Catalogs are meant to be fairly simple in terms of their payload. We're having lots of discussions about various iterations of how extensive should entries be and so forth, but really the core aspects of a catalog contain information about the titles that are available, the information about each of those titles that you wish to convey, the formats that the title is available in, if you're making a title available for a transaction, like a PDF or a MOBI or an EPUB, and then the ways that the title could be acquired. So obviously, some of us will be selling titles, some of us will be making titles available for just download, a library might be interested in lending a title, and so forth. And all of those might point to different kinds of transactions. So the way it works in simple terms, a reader should be able to browse a catalog of titles. I showed you a web browser example, but if you're using Aldico or Ibis or Stanza, you're browsing an OPDS catalog now. You select a title that you're interested in. For more information, you decide to make a purchase decision, and then you obtain the book, about which I'll talk a little bit more later, and then you install and read the book, and it's there right in front of you. So OPDS, again, makes possible a very streamlined discovery and acquisition process. Now, for the best user experience, a catalog will provide some glue that allows a user to navigate to the best, to their best affordance. So that would include some kind of intelligent hierarchy. So if you're a publisher with many different kinds of titles, how do you want to present that catalog information? Some kind of flexible search interface across titles, whether you're a single publisher or particularly if you're an aggregator. And some kind of faceting. So, ideally, if you're able to facet in terms of publication dates, authors, major subject areas, and so forth, again, aids navigation. In many, particularly for large catalogs, it's useful to have some human touch in designing these features, but simple aspects of them can be built algorithmically, like top 20 selling titles or most recently published, and so forth. And catalog information can be generated even using something as simple as Excel spreadsheets. But it would be trivial to write little bits of code that enable the creation out of Onyx or Mark or other kinds of publisher-held data. And in fact, the Internet Archive and other organizations are working to build these kinds of utility programs to enable people to build OPDS catalogs very easily. So this is actually not a major hurdle. And internally, OPDS catalogs use a very simple metadata scheme called Simple Dublin Core to record basic information about the titles. Now, many people in publishing might ask, well, why aren't you using Onyx for this? Isn't this what Onyx was built for? And here you have to consider what the tremendous advantages of Atom are. Atom is as near a universal XML standard as you could obtain in the industry, in the web industry. So it reaches far beyond publishing. So there are already applications that understand Atom, like web browsers, that don't understand. It would be difficult to imagine how they could understand Onyx feeds. And Onyx is an extremely complex standard. Modifying it to support this need would be difficult. And then, of course, it's embedded in a already extant standards process, and working through that process to modify it, particularly in the kind of fast evolving industry that we're in right now, would be quite awkward. And one of the nice things about Atom is because it's using this very lightweight schema, you can link in additional information into an OPDS catalog or provide linkages between the catalog and other information sources very, very trivially. So that could be book reviews, you could point to reading lists, you could point to annotations, fan fiction sites, and so forth. So we rolled out the sort of post-lexical stanza work for the first time only this last fall in October in San Francisco at a meeting that the Internet Archive organized with the assistance of these organizations, O'Reilly, 3Press, FeedBooks, and Book Oven. So already you can see many friends amongst you who have been involved in OPDS since the very early days. And we had very good attendance at that meeting for an early stage development effort, including these names. Again, many of them you will recognize, and actually some that I'm just not able to name because they didn't want to publicly provide evidence of their attendance. But there were some surprising and interesting people there. So with that as a backdrop to what OPDS is and what it attempts to do, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that OPDS and BookServer as an architecture face, and sort of indirectly address some of the issues that we face as a larger industry at the same time. So for this vision to work, we really need a good ecosystem of independent reading applications, reading agents. This whole architecture is not meant to provide comfort to Adobe, Amazon, Google. And if those are the only three places that we can find books in the future, this effort will have been wasted. This whole effort is meant to democratize book access to as many different places as possible and to ensure control by publishers, by libraries, and by bookstores whenever possible to set their prices and their terms for usage and make that information available to as many people as possible. And for that ecosystem to work, there has to be revenue in this somehow. And so reading application developers and other parts of this ecosystem have to be able to work with licensing deals, subscriptions, content sales that ultimately provide revenue back into a community that's vending books, so that the revenue isn't, again, captured only through a very small set of dominant actors. So this means that publishers have to be able to contribute front list content into the systems that are consuming OPDS catalogs. So we're really looking for publishers to be able to expose their data in OPDS format so it can be consumed by reading applications and made available for sale or for other kinds of consumption. Now, this is an open development process, and what that means is we're still in draft. And so while OPDS is fairly baked right now as an early stage standard, we're continuing to develop it. There are lots of interesting questions that get raised when you start creating this kind of construct and putting it out in the marketplace. And the uses that we're already beginning to see are far beyond what we had earlier imagined in really exciting ways, but that also push us to consider how we might support some of those uses. And we certainly have things that we need to work through. Now, some of these are important, some of them are sort of desiderata that we want to address. But this isn't something that you can just support as a publisher and then walk away from. This is something that we're continuing to evolve. It is an early stage effort. I want to talk about 10 or 11 particular challenges in this. And again, I think these hold true not just for OPDS, but how we conceptualize finding books online generally. And the first of these is aggregation. I mean, the first problem that I noted was, how do people find books? And it's very difficult when information about books is stranded across multiple points of discovery. And so you solve that problem by aggregating. But when you aggregate, you have to have either some common metadata, some common data threads, or you've got to be able to normalize across wildly disparate data streams. So this is a common problem. We all face it whenever we aggregate. But to the extent that which we can start moving toward agreement on what we're specifying and how we're specifying, life gets easier. And then judgments will get made. I don't think any OPDS catalog will ever be perfect if it's an aggregation across many different sources. But the trick is to figure out ways of reducing the greatest noise so that the experience for the user or the distributor is as good as possible. Metadata, again, sort of lies at the heart of that. And one of the things that an aggregator particularly will want to do is not confuse a potential buyer with 14 editions of a book that are coming at them from 10 different sources. And so figuring out ways of presenting that to the user is a challenge. And so you might use tricks like Ferber, which comes primarily out of the library market, to group titles together, or other kinds of heuristics that provide a better discovery experience for people. Identifiers, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this. I think we all recognize the challenge of sort of identifying an author across multiple sources of data, of identifying editions, of identifying titles, and so forth. And this is something that's being worked on in many different industries. And unfortunately, we're seeing this plethora of standards begin to emerge here, and hopefully there'll be some intersections and people working together in this area. Territorial rights, I certainly, give a hand to folks like Michael Tamblyn who are trying to address what's out there already in their applications. But in my mind, there's very little logical sense for territorial rights in a digital book market. And if you think about territorial rights in the way that they've traditionally been constructed, they just easily break digital book vending. Now, what makes more sense in many cases might be language-oriented rights. And indeed, Spanish language is, of course, an example of rights that tend to be held across the world in a language domain. Japanese is another example of that for other reasons. But this makes much more sense than trying to figure out, on the point of a reading application developer, where is the user coming from? What are the following 6 or 8 editions of this book should be the one that they have access to buy or to borrow? That's a very difficult row to hoe. And generally, I think, if you think about the regional DVD encoding issue and the sort of the pain that causes people who are trying to buy or experience DVDs that might have been produced in a different market. It's some way analogous to the impact of territorial rights on digital books. And I think it's something that we should try to avoid. Search, again, particularly if you're aggregating, but even if you're a large publisher, finding a title across hundreds or thousands, or in our case, hundreds of thousands of titles is a non-trivial exercise. We endorse another standard called OpenSearch, but OpenSearch itself is a relatively young standard that has not seen a lot of extensive ongoing development. So there are questions that get raised about whether or not we need to adopt OpenSearch or how do we add on to OpenSearch. But thinking about the general problem of finding a book or a potential small set of books across a large volume of titles is something that we're just not very good at. Faceting. So if you're trying to browse a huge number of books on a small screen, you want to break up the display by as many different facets as possible so that the user can find the book that they want as quickly as they want. So this works in concert with search. Now, formally, a facet defines a set of orthogonal characteristics, so characteristics that don't impinge on each other. So date of publication, language, would be facets, for example. And so those are the kinds of navigation aids that you might be able to build into an OPDS catalog at a top level of navigation to permit people to find a book more readily. Now, one of the things that we can do automatically, again, is, what's been selling quickly? What is the stuff that's been published most recently? Those are easy. But if you're a decent-sized publisher publishing in many categories, you might either have to encode that information in metadata, ideally, or do some hand shifting. DRM. So at the Internet Archive, we're no fans of DRM. On the other hand, we're very interested in figuring out how to build more extensive lending models as a library for books that might not be available new and through major online bookstores. So to do that, if we could figure out a way to do that, we would want to protect those books. And right now, our only choice is essentially the Adobe ecosystem. Liza spoke about some of the issues with Adobe earlier, but Adobe ACS is a fairly heavy solution for DRM, and I think it would be a wonderful thing to figure out what an open standard for DRM might look like and how we might implement it. And it might not be a hard, closed system, but it would still be a system that would allow us to minimize risk of great dispersal of our content. It would at least provide a disincentive without frustrating the user experience. One of the disadvantages of DRM right now is that when it fails, it often breaks the user experience. And we really need to think about how we might want to create a DRM system that, when it does fail, mitigates the impact on the individual user who probably legitimately acquired that content to begin with. And if you think about places where you might want to see competition, DRM systems, or content management systems generally, is one of those areas. So we're very interested in fostering approaches in this space. Vending. So I mentioned that buying the book is a little bit of a challenge. Now, the reason this goes to a heart of underlying net dynamics, and that is there's no common abstraction for buying anything, any object online. Now, there are dominant payment systems, PayPal, Google, Amazon, right? But there's no way to sort of encode in a program a generic purchase application. So you could say, what are the credentials, what's the amount, what's the region, and so forth. And so for a vendor of an ebook, so reading book application, or anyone else who's selling books on a mobile device, they essentially have to kick you into the purchasing space of a PayPal, Amazon, Adobe, or other proprietary purchasing system. And that disrupts user flow. So this isn't intrinsic to OPDS per se, it's a need for a larger sort of abstraction of how we do payments online that's international. And we don't have that. And having that would be a huge benefit to sellers of widgets as well as books. Lending. I mentioned that IA would love to figure out how to lend books. We don't see lending as renting. We are a digital library. We would like to figure out how to do this. So in essence, we're trying to figure out a way of thinking about digital for sale while being as rights respectful as absolutely possible. We don't want to lend books that are available new from a bookseller, for example. But how do you stipulate this in an OPDS catalog is something that we'll have to work on. Do we have to include, for example, terms of lending? How much of that information do we have to encode in the catalog for that to work? Now there's another one, which is as OPDS catalogs start to mushroom, because they are very easy to produce, there's no simple way of saying, hi, I just built an OPDS catalog. And so right now, what you do is, you hope you know somebody in the marketplace who's very active in the OPDS community, and then they tell all of their friends. And so I can tell Liza and Hadrian at Feed Books and folks at InkMesh and so forth, hey, there's a new OPDS catalog at this university press. So we'll have to figure out ways of doing that in the long run. That could be the equivalent of some kind of ping server, where you tell one party or a small number of servers, hey, I have an OPDS catalog, and then they distribute or publish information that others can subscribe to for updates, right? But we haven't figured out exactly how this is done yet. But this is going to be more and more of a problem as people, publishers, and individuals start creating OPDS catalogs. And actually that points to one other that I don't have a slide for in this deck, which is that increasingly we're going to start to see a need and a desire for individuals to publish their own OPDS catalogs. Now you might think, why would they do that? Well, the simple answer is because every user, every reader is going to want to have their own personal bookshelf. Now ideally, that bookshelf is portable, right? So I would love, regardless of where I bought the book, I would love to be able to sort of encode the books that are in my library across the devices that I have, and have that bookshelf be portable. And maybe that's hosted with Google Books, maybe it's hosted with IBIS, maybe it's hosted with Amazon. But OPDS actually provides us an opportunity, a window, to think about how we can solve that need for users. And we haven't developed that functionality yet, but we're certainly cognizant of that need. So just to close out, this is, as I stated, an open development process. So please, if you have interest, participate. There's a mailing list, a Google Groups called OpenPub. It's open for subscription. And the actual development is taking place on a Google code page with the URL listed above. And if you simply search Google code for OpenPub, you should be able to find this link. Failing anything else, many of us who are working on this would welcome any inquiries you have. And then, very interested in your questions, and that's my contact information. Thank you. If your world is Onyx, you could think of it as a subset of Onyx. I mean, we're not using Onyx statements in most cases in order to embed information, but the kinds of things that you would want to incorporate in an Onyx statement or feed or record, some of those are embedded in these statements. No, there's no explicit field right now specified for that, but it would not be difficult to incorporate that in the standard if people wanted to do that. Now, I think there are various motivations for including pieces of information in a record statement, and not all of them necessitate actually making a specification in the standard itself. And some of them, for various purposes, might be just good user practice in terms of, like, I'm a publisher as a user. So good publisher practice might be to make sure that I'm embedding that information so it's available for access by a reading system. So that's one of the challenges that we have, is trying to figure out which pieces of information do we actually need to sort of hard codify into the standard, and which pieces of information can we essentially publish as best practices or fact-based pointers. But those are the kinds of use cases that we want to hear about so that we can discuss them and figure out how to best incorporate them. So I wouldn't prejudice anything to say that we certainly have had some discussions about how BNC can work in the BookServer architecture world. Those are exactly the kinds of aggregations of data and processes that lend a hand to, I think, OPDS development and the BookServer architecture generally. Even, for example, the Internet Archive runs a system called Open Library, which is meant to be a compendium of information about books. The premise is one wiki page per book. And we're trying to embed and link to as much information as we possibly can. And again, we've had some preliminary discussions with BNC about that service and how we can incorporate those skeins of data. But we see OPDS essentially as being able to tap or be a filter out of information that exists out in the world about books, and being able to form a condensed version of that information that's easily distributable and easily consumed by a wide range of applications. Yeah, I think one of the advantages of it being based on Atom is that all the affordances that you get with the news feed, you get with OPDS. So, sort of the implicit notification of new titles, the easy-to-consume basis of information are all there. So it's actually quite distinct from the kinds of needs that people typically would produce an Onyx feed for. At the Internet Archive, we're reginning our OPDS catalog at least daily now, and unless something breaks. In many cases, as we add titles into our database through our scanning operations, we're automatically reginning our catalog. So it's a relatively trivial way of us to continually push out news of what new titles do we have available for people in what formats, like EPUB and Mobi and DAISY and so forth. Okay, thank you very much.